Denver for the PAT. Get out there and break it.
Saints-Bears did go to overtime, by the way.
Not great for me. All right, don't tell me what happens. I've got Denver kicking. Well, they jumped the snap and they made it anyways, and that's ball game. So, not great.
I'm pulling for more DJ Dallas garbage time points.
I split some DJ Dallas and Travis Homer, and turns out Travis Homer is just emergency back, which is cool.
It's the Awesemo NFL Showdown live before lock. Eagles and Cowboys, which exactly what we wanted to see, is more NFC East primetime games for whatever reason. The NFL seems like we get one of these every week. The Eagles, the Giants, one of these teams always in primetime. Actually, two of them, because not only do we have Eagles, Cowboys tonight, but we've got the Giants playing the Buccaneers in primetime tomorrow. They're probably going to get smashed. Tonight's show is sponsored by No House Advantage. We've got a little promo going on today too, guys. If you subscribe to the Awesemo Podcast Network and the YouTube channel, there's a giveaway here. Like the pin tweet on Awesemo_com and subscribe to the channel. One person will be selected to win a free month of Awesemo Plus. And that's all you have to do. There's nothing else to it. So now, Kyle, once again, you're with me for Sunday Night Live Before Lock, which, by the way, as I said, I'm not even on the schedule for Sunday Live Before Lock, yet I've done the show more than anybody else. Emac's never able to do it. There was a couple of times you weren't around. So I'm an honorary member of the show, I guess, because I'm not on it, but yet I'm on it just about every single week. So the one thing that we really need to try to figure out for the show, and it's something that I'm not sure anybody could be all that confident in, is what do we make of Ben Dinucci? What do you think of him as a quarterback, and what do you expect him to do tonight?
Yeah, I mean, he's probably not good. Like, there is a strong amount of evidence dating back to his time at Pitt, where I think he was benched multiple times in college. Then he transfers to James Madison, plays well there, but fails at a higher level than succeeds at a lower level isn't generally the strategy to work your way into being a successful NFL quarterback. Then obviously he doesn't come in with any acclaim to the NFL as a third string quarterback. He's probably not good. That is just simply put, your Gardner Minshews are exceedingly rare. And at this point, it looks like Gardner Minshew isn't even that good anyway. So these guys who come out of nowhere are typically out of nowhere for a reason and will go back to nowhere at some point. But the one interesting thing is, especially James Madison, he was an avid rusher. I think he had 9 and 7 touchdowns in back-to-back seasons, went over 500 yards in his final season, and they're going to throw a lot. They have simply no choice as long as the Eagles are competent, which their offense has actually looked fine in recent weeks. So given that the Eagles are a competent team facing one of, if not the NFL's worst defenses, we're going to see 40-plus attempts from Dinucci. That's a lot of dropbacks that could also convert to rushes as well. So do I think it's efficient? God, no, I don't think it's going to be very efficient. But do I think he has potential, and do I think he's cheap? Yeah, all of those factors are in play.
So I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, 40, I would be pretty surprised if he actually throws the ball 40-plus times. Not that I can't see it happening, because, the Cowboys are double-digit underdogs in this spot, and it is a game, obviously. The Cowboys aren't a tanking team. The NFC East is way up for grabs. I think, actually, Aaron Schatz had tweeted out earlier in the week that he did a sim for the final projected standings in the NFC East, and it was the winning team wins 7 or less games 63% of the time. And there was also, I think it was a 3% time that the winning team has 4 wins. So the NFC East is way up in the air. There's no point where they're tanking at this point in the season. So they're going to be doing everything they can to win, and I think they're going to be fighting to the end. So maybe there's something to that they'll let Dinucci throw the ball 40 times if they are behind, because they're certainly going to be playing to win. And something about that I think is interesting is sponsor the show, No House Advantage. If you guys haven't played on No House Advantage, it's a different way to play DFS. Instead of just having props like there are at sports books, instead of just having DFS player prices or something like that, it's a combination of the two. You're making lineups based on player props, and you build a DFS type card around those player props, and then it pays out like a DFS contest. After that, GPPs, which, by the way, if you want to get in on one right now, it's only a little over half full right now, the Sunday night contest in No House Advantage. So with that said, there's a prop for Ben Dinucci, 220.5 passing yards. With that in mind, do you like the over or the under? I mean, you just said you think he could throw 40 times, so he would have to be ridiculously inefficient to hit the under on 220.5.
Yeah, I think it was I'll just preface this with I definitely like the over there, because like you said, it would have to be a ridiculously inefficient game from him to not get there on 40 plus attempts. And the team was averaging, I think off the top of my head, like 44.6 attempts per game. And it didn't really change, especially in their first week with Andy Dalton, who I think topped 50 attempts. And it's simply because they have no choice. I'm sure that if they could get like 5 yards a carry out of Zeke, they would happily grind him into dust for 25, 30 attempts in a game. But that's just not like, one, Zeke hasn't been incredibly efficient this year, and it's been only worse since they've lost Dak Prescott. And two, like, even if that was the case, it'd probably still be less than optimal to do that, assuming you're losing. So yeah, if I think, which I do think he's going to go over 40 attempts, I absolutely think that's a pretty easy over for me.
And then something else about No House Advantage is that when you're ready to make your first deposit, No House Advantage will match it up to $20 in free play when you use the promo code Awesemo. Refer a friend and get $5 more after your first deposit. Beat your friends, not the house. Win big with player props today. So you talked about Ezekiel Elliott here and what we think that they could utilize him and how they. I do think that if this game is marginally close, then I do think that they're just going to look to give the ball to Zeke as much as possible. But given the spread, that's probably not the most likely outcome, right? I think we have to think that just based on that, the Cowboys are probably going to be playing from behind. With that said, Zeke over under 70.5 rushing yards.
So like maybe this would be a bit contrarian. I guess I'd take the under here. He's only seen 12 carries in back-to-back games. And maybe it's a little bit of my my DFS mindset seeping into it, but he hasn't gotten a lot of work specifically as a runner in the past 2 games because they've been losing. That has been simply put like the only reason I think we're going to see bad games going forward from Zeke. He's fine. Like I don't think he's like incredibly talented, but he's good. He gets the ball a lot, but that only happens when the team can stay competitive. And based on this line, more than a touchdown underdog they are. It doesn't seem like they're going to be competitive. And in that scenario, we've seen in back-to-back games, it simply doesn't set up for Zeke to get the ball enough where like he has to break off a 50-plus yarder if he's only going to get 12, 14 carries. And that just doesn't seem all that likely for any running back, no matter how good they are. So I'll take the under on this. And I think we'll probably continue talking about Zeke under style plays going forward.
You know what's kind of funny about this, and this is a weird kind of comp for Zeke, but the way he's being used right now, because the Cowboys are always trailing, he's almost like a poor man's Alvin Kamara, where they're down and they don't necessarily need to just run on the ball, but they still want to get him touches. So they throw him a lot, and he's just nowhere. They throw the ball to him a lot, and he's just nowhere near as efficient as Kamara. But do you understand the comp I'm making there, where it's like you said, Zeke only carried the ball 12 times last week, but with that said, he's still getting touches. Just a lot of them come in the passing game. He just doesn't really do that much with them. And he doesn't necessarily have the same big play upside that Kamara has. I don't necessarily hate Zeke in this spot, but I do think he's a little overpriced on both FanDuel and DraftKings.
Yeah, I like that comp, especially last week. I think he was targeted twice, but the week before that was the like exact scenario where he doesn't get a ton of carries. Not like Kamara is more because like you don't need to give Kamara a ton of carries. He's incredibly efficient, and they have a backup running back in Murray who's actually good. Whereas Zeke didn't have the choice. Like the only way they were going to get him the ball was in the passing game. And I think it was 2 weeks ago versus probably the Cardinals, saw 11 targets. So that game specifically is very Alvin Kamara-like, where he almost like splits his workload completely, like over 20 touches, but splits it completely between pass catching and running. And if they're going to be underdogs and they want to continue to get Zeke involved, he probably will look like some Frankenstein version of Alvin Kamara. Unfortunately, like there are very few players who can do what Alvin Kamara does. So, like you said, he certainly doesn't he has a ton of upside because he could get the ball a ton. And if you build lineups based on, and I think you should have some of your lineups out there that don't strictly just say like, well, Vegas is always right. We can't doubt them. If you build some lineups based on the idea that like Dallas comes out and manages to pull up this incredible upset, or at least keep it fairly close, Zeke is totally in play. But I do agree, based on everything I've said right now, that barring quite an interesting turn of events, in regards to the massive spread we have right now, I do think Zeke is probably overpriced on both sides.
So Calvin in the chat brings up something that I think is an interesting talking point, because he said, when has Zeke not crushed the Eagles? And I'm not saying that you have to not play Zeke. I'm just saying I don't think he's necessarily the best per dollar play. But here's the deal. When you look at something like historical matchup against an individual team for a player like Zeke, the Cowboys have had terrific offensive lines in the past. They don't right now. They've also had competent players at quarterback in the past, and we don't know if they have that tonight. I mean, we have no clue we're getting out of Ben Dinucci. He's a 7th-round rookie quarterback that we've seen make a handful of throws in the NFL. And to be honest, I thought he looked pretty good on some of the dropbacks he had last week, but I just don't know what we're getting out of him. So I think if you look at Zeke, I'm not necessarily saying that I think he's a great or a terrible play. I just kind of think he's somewhere in between for this particular slate. But I also think you can't look at what he's done in the past against the Eagles, because this isn't the same situation at all. The Eagles defense is different than it's been in previous years. And the Cowboys offensive line from now is vastly different than it was a few years ago, when for years they were consensus top 5, maybe even best offensive line in the league, to the point where Alfred Morris took over the starting job for Zeke at one point a couple years ago, and he smashed. So you can't really look at those sort of matchups previously against teams. I mean, there are certain situations where maybe it makes sense. To me, this isn't one of them.
Yeah, I agree. I generally wouldn't look too much into like one player versus specific opponent, if only because like there are probably no players in the NFL who have a large enough sample that is accurate enough to their current NFL situation where that can apply. Just 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 games versus an opponent really isn't that large of a sample on what a player is going to do. And obviously, if they're all versus the same opponent, they date back 5, 6 years. Like I was thinking like Larry Fitzgerald probably has some divisional opponents that he has like a large enough sample that you would be like, oh, that's interesting. But they date back to a point where he wasn't Larry Fitzgerald. There's no player who sustains their situation and their level of play and then gets to play like enough opponents at the same time in that situation, that level of play. It's too small of a sample for me to read too much into. And we don't, like you said, we don't really have, regardless of opponent, much of a historical comp for Zeke, because he has always had good quarterback play. And up until basically this season, a little bit last season, he's always had good offensive line play. And he's often had great quarterback play and great offensive line play. So this is simply a Zeke that we haven't seen this kind of Ezekiel Elliott anymore. Thought of another good comp for him. I think he's like David Montgomery.
It kind of is, because David Montgomery is getting a little bit of passing work this year also.
He is now, yeah.
With Tariq Cohen gone, and oh man, does David Montgomery suck? But there's always going to be something that'll be like, I guess I should have like 6% David Montgomery or something. For some reason he just always ends up in a small percentage of my lineups. One other thing that I wanted to read in the chat, because I thought this was funny, is somebody said, Is Dinucci a pizza restaurant? There's actually a pizza restaurant in my town called Dinucci. So
really?
It could be his family that owns it, for all I know. Very, very possible. So I thought that was really funny when I read that joke. Let's talk about some of the passing options here, because this is where I think the Cowboys really are tough to figure out right now with Dinucci at quarterback, especially because, I mean, this offense was just a gold mine for passing value 3 weeks ago when Prescott was the quarterback. Now we've got Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, and Michael Gallup. These guys are all cheaper than they were earlier in the year, especially Michael Gallup, who's gone from being one of the kind of like mid-price to second highest price Cowboys receiver to now he's bargain price. But I don't know what to make of any of these guys now that Dinucci's at quarterback. When you look at the three of them, which, if any, are you the most confident in?
Yeah, I think Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb basically get the same amount of confidence from me. They're playing very similar roles in terms of the volume and the ADOT they see. I think over the past 2 weeks, it has been Amari Cooper has a 2 target and like -2 air yard edge. Like obviously it's not an edge. He basically has the same amount of targets, same amount of air yards as CeeDee Lamb. Michael Gallup being completely left in the dust. I believe he has 9 targets, of which he's caught like 3 or 4. And that's because Michael Gallup, of all these guys, is running the most difficult to hit routes for bad quarterbacks, which like Andy Dalton played as a bad quarterback. And Dinucci, even if he looked decent, still wasn't doing a great job hitting Michael Gallup on, it wasn't very much of a sample size. Simply put, if you're going to get guys who run like low ADOT, crossing routes, slants, these like short routes, they're probably easier to hit for backup quarterbacks, regardless of which one it's going to be. And Michael Gallup running 20 yards downfield is a very difficult throw to hit that requires like arm strength, timing, being good at football, recognizing things. And not sure if the Dallas Cowboys are going to have that. With that being said, he is so incredibly cheap. And I think people are going to look so much at these past 2 games, right, and most of the season, frankly, where he hasn't done much and not really be interested in him. And I get that. But in these large field tournaments, it's big pivots like that if it hits, are going to win you the slate. So I actually like Michael Gallup only as a contrarian play. Like I think I would be like massively concerned that he goes out, gets 3 deep targets, and all of them are into the stands. But do I think everyone else recognizes that and is probably overplaying that? Yeah. 3, 4, 5 deep targets in a game is a lot of upside. And if no one's going to play him and he's going to be low priced as well, I think he's maybe the most interesting for tournaments. The other 2, I don't have a strong lean. They both play the same role. CeeDee Lamb, I believe, is slightly cheaper. So I guess he gets my vote of confidence, but they're basically the same player in terms of volume.
That's also how I feel about the Lamb versus Cooper thing is Cooper is decently more expensive on DraftKings, $1,600 more. And then on FanDuel, he's ridiculously expensive, $14,500. So he's $2,500 more expensive than CeeDee Lamb. Yet if you go back to the pricing, the last time the Cowboys played in a primetime game, Cooper Lamb was more expensive than Cooper.
Yeah.
So just think of it that way. Is one thing I really like to use as a barometer for kind of a baseline in terms of how much production I expect from players is just going to be historical pricing, where I look at and I go like, okay, what were these guys priced a couple weeks ago? And when there's a big fluctuation like that, I have to think, all right, what's been done to deserve that? And not really that much, frankly. If we're looking at Lamb versus Cooper, I think that CeeDee Lamb is also very, very good. This, by the way, this rookie wide receiver class is insane. But I think that Lamb versus Cooper, I don't think there's going to be a massive difference in fantasy production between the two going forward. We also have Cooper projected for more ownership than CeeDee Lamb. With all that considered, the price difference, I think Lamb is the better play. So I'm going to agree with you there. Let's see if there's any questions on the chat here. Gallup was on the field for 90% of the plays last week. Cooper might get slate coverage. Yeah, I mean, for the price on Gallup, I think the one concern you have here, which, I mean, you talked about a little bit, boom or bust option. But at the same time, too, he's so cheap that we've seen Michael Gallup catch those long touchdown passes so often. I mean, he just breaks one of those and he breaks the entire slate. So it's very possible. I agree with you. I think that he's a decent GPP play. Why don't you rank the three Cowboys wideouts in terms of priority for you as a GPP play, 1 to 3? What would those rankings be?
Just in terms of my overall ownership, I would have probably Lamb, Cooper, Gallup still. But in terms of my ownership relative to the field, like I'm not going to have a ton of Gallup. He's not a great play, but I'm going to have a lot more of him than the field will have. Whereas Amari Cooper, I'm probably with or below the field on. I have to check our ownership projections again. But yeah, I think I'm actually below the field on Cooper, above the field on both Lamb, and significantly on Gallup because it doesn't take that much. So in terms of like how good of a tournament play they are and how much I prioritize them relative to the rest of the people prioritizing them, I guess you would say it's probably CD, Gallup, and then Cooper. Yeah, that's the same order I have. And then somebody else in the chat also just threw and they asked Michael Gallup or Dalton Schultz. For me, it's Gallup. I think Schultz is okay. I mean, he got a lot of red zone work when Prescott was there, but he just doesn't have that same big play upside as Gallup. With the contingency that I've been on the wrong side of Dalton Schultz every single time so far this year. But I still think there's a lot more upside in Michael Gallup. Dalton Schultz, somebody who I wouldn't say you can't play him, but if you're rostering somebody in that mid 3K price range, Gallup is the priority for me over Schultz. Yeah, I completely agree. They're essentially the same price. Gallup is 200 cheaper, I believe. Yeah, 200 cheaper for a player who just undoubtedly has so much more upside. And it's not like you get this like locked in loaded floor with Dalton Schultz at this point, like outside of CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper, you're not getting a floor with any of these guys. So I would say almost certainly that I would just take Michael Gallup for not only like a price discount, but we don't have him as like crazy high owned, especially relative to like Dalton Schultz. Not a ton of popularity on Schultz. Not that much either on Gallup, though. So if their ownership is not going to be a chasm between the two, the price is the same, you just gain so much more upside with Michael Gallup. Yeah, and then one other note on this before we move on to talk about some of the rest of the Cowboys here is, so Gallup and Schultz, basically the same price on DraftKings. They're projected for about the same ownership. But if you look at our Awesemo Top Showdown single game tool, which is something I like to use a lot when I build lineups, we have Gallup with 2x the chance of ending up in the optimal lineup as compared to Dalton Schultz. So all that considered and everything else basically being equal, Gallup looks like the stronger play of the two. While we're talking about the Cowboys passing game, I think this is also a good time to talk about the Eagles defense. Usually I like to split the teams up, except I think that while we're on the topic of Dinucci and the Cowboys offense, the Eagles defense kind of fits in here. This is very expensive for a not very good defense. And obviously this is irrelevant on FanDuel because they don't have defenses, but $6,200 for the Eagles defense on DraftKings. I'm kind of mixed on this because on one hand, this is a ridiculously high price tag for a defense. On the other hand, too, Dinucci might be totally bummed. And we just don't know right now. But I mean, there's a chance that, like you said, if he's going to drop back 40 times in a game where the Cowboys get crushed, if he's no good, that is so many opportunities for the Eagles defense to score fantasy points. So that's where I'm really conflicted. Do you have a strong feeling one way or the other? Because I can't really make up my mind whether the Eagles are viable or not on this slate. Yeah, so I definitely think they're viable. Do I love them? No, because like you said, they're a lot of money for a position that generally doesn't have a ton of great outings. This would be the spot, though, where that would change. I would say potentially with the Eagles defense, it's simply that, if they're going to have a good game, it's probably closer to or similar to like a binary range of outcomes where it's probably just a touchdown, which is a binary thing. Either you do score a touchdown or multiple touchdowns against Dinucci, or you don't have that good of a game. You're certainly probably not, if we see even a decent amount of scoring, making the optimal lineup or smashing. So they're a candidate. I know Alex Awesemo Baker himself has talked about this when we're on for, I think Thursday live before lock is when we go on, that because we've seen so much scoring so recently, and a lot of it's been in like big primetime games like, Seattle, Arizona or whatever, we haven't seen a lot of ownership on defenses, and there never is, but there's also not been really any ownership on them in captain. And it's not non-zero to hit. We actually saw the Patriots just run off a string of games where they did it last year. And I think the Eagles are in play for that. They would also, if you're playing them in captain, save you a ton of money. So I think they're okay. Their price is a lot, but because their ceiling does include like a touchdown, whereas kickers don't obviously have that access, I think they're acceptable. I wouldn't go crazy on them, but obviously the matchup is good. They do have a good ceiling, and they'll probably be relatively lowly owned.
I will say this, in our projections, we have them with a nearly 30% chance to end up in the optimal lineup, which is by far the highest I've ever seen for defense. Usually it's like sub 10%. It's, like 8%, 5% or something like that. And I've never seen it this high. So that does lend a little bit of credence to the idea of rostering the Eagles defense here. We have a super chat here from Trent Bossingham. I think that's how his last name is pronounced. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I don't know Trent, but thanks for the super chat. He has a question. His lineup: Wentz, Ward, Fulgham, Scott from the Eagles. And on the Cowboys side, he has Lamb and Zeke. He wants to know thoughts on this for a GPP. And then he thanks us. Let's see, Wentz, Ward, Fulgham, Scott. Individually, I don't have an issue with any of those plays. And CeeDee Lamb, we've said, is our favorite Cowboys receiver. I think Zeke is fine in this spot also. Do you have any issues with Wentz, Ward, Fulgham, or Scott? Scott's actually my favorite play overall in this contest. So I don't have any issues with it. Are any of those guys that stand out and you just go, oh, that's a terrible play. You have to press the eject button, go back to the drawing board, redo the whole thing.
No, I don't think so. I think that all makes sense to me. So I assume you said Wentz, Ward, Fulgham, Scott. I assume that means Wentz at captain, right?
Maybe.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. So did it not saying the question? Regardless, I guess. No, there's nothing outright wrong with that. I don't think there's like I'd say maybe the only thing is that's probably a lineup that I'd look to play like more in like low entry total single entry stuff, because it doesn't seem to have like a ton of leverage on the field. But like if you're playing in a low stakes or low entry contest, I don't think there's a problem with that. There's certainly nothing like egregiously bad about it by any means.
Let's see, what other questions here? Yeah, a couple people mentioning on the Eagles. Some people are talking about the Eagles in the captain spot. Yeah, I mean, if there's ever a spot where it's viable, it's probably this is the one. It's still honestly, though, not my favorite play for the captain spot. I mean, CeeDee Lamb is around the same price range, and in theory, he should have more upside than the Eagles defense. We have the Eagles with a 3% chance to be the top scorer overall on the slate. And the other thing, too, is like, what are you saving money for here? Right. This isn't a slate. This isn't a slate where you need to jam in both quarterbacks. This isn't a slate where, we've got Russell Wilson going up against Patrick Mahomes or something like that. So if you're rostering the Eagles defense, it's, what are you really trying to spend up for? So I don't think you need to roster them in the captain spot. I think they're fine as a utility play, but captain, I think, might be overdoing it a little bit. Just I'm thinking about the lineup construction and in terms of what you really are, what you really have a realistic upside in with the Eagles. I don't think it's necessary on this slate.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I'd be going too crazy in it. And it is something that is like, it is only for the largest contest. And any like single entry, low stake stuff, there's no need to get that contrarian. Like it is always like you were trying not to chop, but when you're playing in a contest with 2,000 people, your odds of doing so aren't very good if you build even like a modestly contrarian lineup. Whereas if you play in a contest with 100,000 people, the scale shifts completely, where your odds of chopping, if you build like a median projection style lineup, increase exponentially. And not only that, but obviously chopping means that your like expected value decreases exponentially, because even if you do manage to hit the absolute jackpot, your payout is, a fifth, a tenth, a hundredth, whatever of what it would be if you had done it solo. So like the idea behind that is simply that the more unique you get, as long as you're not building like a truly dead lineup, you probably increase your expected value as long as you're building like reasonable lineups. It really does. It does show you just how much the field you're playing in is important to factor in. If I'm playing in a lot of single entry stuff, I'm probably not going too crazy off the board, and I'm probably not getting the Philly defense. If I'm playing in like 150 max stuff, yeah, I probably do have some exposure to Philly defense.
So some people are asking here about 5-1 stacks, just making an onslaught of one team. So I think you have to ask yourself when you're building that lineup is what has to happen for that lineup to go off. And number one, it means that one team steamrolls the other. In this case, it's probably a lot more likely that the Eagles steamroll the Cowboys. Not an impossible situation, and one that I think that if you're going to go a 5-1 stack, I'd be more apt to go towards the Eagles than the Cowboys. But then you have to figure out for that one player on the Cowboys, who would you be running it back in? If the Eagles are to win this game by whatever, 20, 30 points, where a 5-1 onslaught stack ends up paying off, I think the guy you want to roster coming back on the Cowboys side would probably be Tony Pollard, because I think that means then that the Eagles just win by a lot. And then you think, what are the Cowboys going to do in the second half? What are they going to be doing in garbage time? And I think we're at that point then where they're probably not giving Zeke touches. They're probably going to have Tony Pollard on the field. They're probably going to have him getting more of the touches, probably in the passing game too. He could rack up PPR points. And then if you're going to make a 5-1 Cowboys stack, I'd probably run it back with Corey Clement, because I kind of think the same thing on the opposite side. So that's how I would address people asking about the 5-1 lineups. Does that all make sense to you?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I actually like, regardless of the question being 5-1, I like Tony Pollard this week. We've seen him get like an increasing amount of workload in the past few weeks, and he's quite explosive. Not that I care too much about how good a player is, especially if it's a running back who's just kind of a cog in a system. If there was such thing as a good running back, I guess Tony Pollard would qualify. I do think an interesting approach is going 5-1 and Dinucci being the one. Another just more game theory, large field contest thing. But it's non-intuitive. I don't think a lot of people who are building lineups are by hand, or potentially even with optimizers, the way they could set the rules, are going to do that. But if you look at it as he's a guy who could drop back a ton of times, he could just rack up some yards, he could spread it out as well, and he has rushing potential. He could be a guy where if you basically have some money saved by getting deep into your Eagles 5, you could very much see 10 to 15 points from Dinucci being the only viable play on the side of Dallas. So I think he's interesting in a number of ways because of his rushing potential, because of his price, which is so cheap, and because we just don't know. I think there's so much potential upside, or a lot of potential upside in the unknown, that our ownership projections don't have a ton of people playing like Dinucci and captain. So stuff like that I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think Dinucci is a really strong play for more than one reason. And like you said, number one, there's the rushing upside. Two, there's the price. We almost never get to roster quarterbacks for this cheap in Showdown. And even on FanDuel, where he's a little bit more expensive, it's not like he's one of the more expensive players in the game. I mean, Wentz is more expensive. Zeke is more expensive. Amari Cooper is more expensive. It's pretty crazy when you have a wide receiver that's more expensive than his quarterback. So, I look at that. I think that Dinucci is a really fine option for Showdown and for single game, FanDuel and DraftKings. And yeah, if you compare to what his ownership in the captain spot is going to be to what we have his projected odds of being the top highest scorer in the game, referencing the Showdown tool again, it's almost double the field. We have sub 10% projected ownership in the captain spot and 13% chance that he's the highest scorer in the game from a fantasy standpoint. So keeping that in mind, I think that Dinucci's a good play in this contest. Moving down a little bit, are there any other guys that stand out to you from a value perspective? I saw a couple people in the chat ask about Cedric Wilson. I know you touched on Tony Pollard. I agree. I think that he's a pretty good option, especially if you have a lineup that doesn't have Zeke. I think it almost has to have Tony Pollard in it. That's something else I'll say is that in Fantasy Cruncher, I think you should probably set up a rule that the lineups have one or the other, because it's pretty hard to see there being a situation where neither one of them has a good game.
Yeah, I very much agree that the correlation between them would probably be highly negative, because even we saw, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where Zeke goes out and fumbles on back-to-back drives and essentially just gets benched for a handful of drives. And that's largely where you see Pollard come in, is times where Zeke isn't performing well, or potentially in the 5-1 scenario that you laid out, where the game is just kind of dusted. And that point we saw on the other end last year when Dallas was actually good, or at least winning some games. Whenever the game got out of hand, that's when we saw a lot of Pollard. So I agree. These are two guys whose volume is just completely inversely correlated to each other. So I like that approach. Yeah, Cedric Wilson is okay. We don't see a lot of these sub 1,000 guys end up making the optimal lineup and make the winning lineups, simply because they are that probably low owned and definitely that low priced almost always for a reason. There are a handful of small examples where injury news breaks, just pricing mistakes, whatever it happens to be, happens, and these guys end up making the optimal lineup. But they're so low priced because they don't get the ball a ton. Cedric Wilson really doesn't project to see much of a role as long as the top 3 receivers are healthy. I think he's probably the best sub 1,000 play of the slate, but I'm still not going to get to him a ton just because like these guys rarely ever hit. Typically what you look at in the winning lineups is a mix of like, there are a lot of plays between 3,000 and, at captain 15 or 20,000, whatever it happens to be. A lot of those guys, or enough of those guys, are going to have good games that you don't really need to dig into these like ugly 4-point plays. I think a good example was Cole Kmet on the last time we saw Chicago. His points per dollar projection, or I guess his points per dollar like outcome, was probably just absolutely bonkers because he had like six or so points, I believe, all of which came on like the first 2 drives, and he was 200 or 400, something like that. That's an incredible value. You simply just don't need to like create that much value in your lineup when you can more effectively just like spend all the money on good mid-range plays. So I think he's okay. I still don't think it's the best play of the slate. I just don't think these guys are often like really smash plays.
Yeah, and when we saw Cedric Wilson play well, and by the way, he got 0 targets last week, but when we saw him play well, it was Dak Prescott was the quarterback, and they were throwing the ball a million times per game, and they were being really efficient. Like you said before, the Cowboys still might throw the ball a bunch, but they're not going to be nearly as efficient with Dinucci at quarterback as they were with Dak Prescott. So let's transition over to the Eagles side of the game, but before that, guys, we've added some great new tools for our NFL Express Pass users. For only $3.95, you could purchase an NFL Weekly Express Pass, which now includes everything you need for NFL Showdown single game contest formats. You get access to our Awesemo's Showdown single game player projections, ownership projections, and top plays tool when you purchase this pass, in addition to player rankings, lineup builder light, ownership rankings, and the top stacks express tool. It's their best offering ever for the NFL Express Pass. So head over to awesemo.com/join today and purchase your NFL Express Pass for $3.95. All right. So with that now out of the way, let's talk about the Eagles side of the game. And I'm going to start right now with my overall favorite play for the captain spot in this game, and that is Boston Scott. I think this is a really, really good game script for him. He's involved in the pass game and the run game anyway, but also we do think the Eagles are probably going to win, most likely. If you look at the spread of this game, it stands to reason that is the most likely outcome. And then look at the snaps from last week. Corey Clement was barely involved. It was the Boston Scott show. Boston Scott was on the field almost every play against the Giants. Corey Clement got, I think it was 16 snaps. Outside of that, it was Boston Scott on the field a ton. And then also, if you look at his ownership in the captain spot, it's going to be mostly Carson Wentz that's in the captain spot. And I think that Wentz is a fine captain, but he's going to be rostered there by almost 25% of the field. You get Boston Scott for captain ownership of about half of what Wentz has. And we actually have Boston Scott projected to have a better chance of being the top scorer in the game compared to Wentz. So with that said, that is my take. Boston Scott versus Carson Wentz. I think both of them are strong plays, but Boston Scott is my overall favorite captain play on this slate. What say you on Boston Scott versus Carson Wentz?
Yeah, I think you laid it out perfectly, and I'll just double down on some of these things we saw last week. Boston Scott got 75% of the carries, got 67% of the backfield targets. It's very clear that like Corey Clement basically after week 1, when him and Scott split time, basically just played a special teams role. And that's what he is. He's a special teams player, whereas Boston Scott is actually a guy who, like, even when Miles Sanders is healthy, gets on the field somewhat. And Miles Sanders is a guy who they invested a ton of money in, or a ton of, I guess, draft capital, not specifically money. They invested a lot of draft capital in him. He looks good, and they still find ways to get Boston Scott involved. Then when he's out, Boston Scott, seemingly based on a small sample, but seemingly is absolutely the guy. The game script sets up well for him. And I'll just double down on one other thing, is that he provides probably really good leverage off of the immense popularity you're going to see with Carson Wentz. Simply put, every touchdown that Boston Scott punches in from the 1 to the 5 are Carson Wentz non-touchdowns. And you even could get the scenario where he throws a passing touchdown to Boston Scott, in which case Scott benefits from that more. So I just think in terms of the way that the game plays out, there are a lot of scenarios where there's a lot of inverse correlation between guys like Carson Wentz and his running back, in this case, Boston Scott. If we're going to see a ton of popularity, which our projections have on Carson Wentz at captain, I think Boston Scott is absolutely a great leverage play. And it's not like you're just like throwing out this weird game theory play. He's simply a good play too. He's not like incredibly expensive for a bell cow back. Our top showdown and single game plays tool loves him as like a very good chance of being the top scorer on the slate. Everything sets up well for him to, like, maybe not even smash, just have a good game. And that could be all you need in a game with kind of a modest total as well. So I think he's a great play, and I'll probably be over the field on him, especially relative to people really loving Carson Wentz.
All right, so we've seen a lot of questions about Dallas Goedert come in, and so one of the key injuries for this game, I mean, the Eagles wide receivers have been banged up basically every week for, I don't know, 4 years now or something like that. And as per usual, Zach Ertz has managed to find himself on the injured list now. So that means Dallas Goedert's going to be taking over as the primary tight end. At this point in their careers, I kind of think Dallas Goedert's probably better than Zach Ertz anyway. Ertz has looked all kinds of dust this year. Goddard, I think, is a decent play. 7,800, maybe a little steep for him. It looks like there's no real leverage to be gained by rostering him. The ownership, 22% in the utility spot, about even with the odds we have him projected to be in the optimal lineup. I think he's a neutral play. I don't have an issue with rostering Dallas Goedert. Don't have anything against him, but it's whatever. I don't think you need to play him or anything like that. How do you feel about Dallas Goedert? And then Travis Fulgham at 9,200. How do you feel about him as a play, those being the top two passing options for Wentz?
Yeah, so I really like Dallas Goedert. I don't think he's like a lock button play by any means. He's not like my primary target on the slate, but he will be a pretty significant guy in terms of like the core players I have, if only because we saw through, I believe it was 3 weeks before he got injured, he was leading the team in essentially all receiving categories outside of air yards, and they have field stretchers who rack up air yards. That's not awfully surprising. Targets, receptions, receiving yards, and I believe tied for touchdowns as well, was the Eagles' number one receiver. He's playing what we would think of as the Zach Ertz role. Now there is no Zach Ertz, and that role should have been valuable. Zach Ertz made it look less valuable than we're sort of expecting to, because he was averaging like 4 yards per target and was completely dust. If we're going to see a number one receiver role occupied by someone who is not Zach Ertz, who's actually good, and we saw that like Dallas Goedert was actually efficient when playing that role in the first few weeks, I think we can think of him as something like, I don't know, maybe not like George Kittle level, but like maybe like Mark Andrews, especially the way Mark Andrews has been kind of disappointing this year, but he's going to play that kind of role for his team. That's a lot of upside against the Dallas defense that cannot stop like a high school team. So I actually think I may be a little bit more excited about Dallas Goedert than you are. Travis Fulgham is difficult because we just we have no sample on what he should look like, because I believe we have 3 games of double digit targets from him. None of those games featured Goedert. None of those games featured Jalen Reagor. So I think that is, I don't know. It's interesting. I'm not really sure what to make of Travis Fulgham. It's just a small sample play. I think I'm just going to look at if he is like popular, if he's going to be popular, which I do believe. Let me see our ownership projections on him. Our captain ownership on him is right now. Yeah, that's what I thought. He is our number 4 owned captain. If our projections, my projections at least, are up to date. Let me refresh and make sure. Yeah, looking at this, he is right now our still our number 4 owned captain. So at that point, we don't have a ton of leverage in playing him. I'll probably be under the field on him. He's fine.
So here's how I feel about Fulgham. I think he's fine also. However, he's a little bit more expensive than Dinucci and Boston Scott, both of whom I think are better plays than Fulgham. The other thing you mentioned too is with Reagor back, what is his role going to be? I think there's a chance that he's just way too cheap, but it's also a little hard to know what to make of him, which, by the way, that's how I feel about every player in this game. So I'm kind of looking at this like, I don't know what to make of anybody. This is one of the harder showdown contests to predict, and it's because we have a 7th round rookie quarterback making his debut in an important divisional rivalry game. Reagor was pretty well regarded coming out of college, 1st round pick, one of the first wide receivers off the board in what's been a loaded wide receiver class. I do think the Eagles are going to look back and probably regret not taking Jefferson in the 1st round over him from what we've seen from him so far. But with that said, we still haven't seen that much from him. 4,400, I think, makes him a viable value option on DraftKings, and he is, where is he on FanDuel? He is at 8,500. I think on both sites he's a pretty decent value play. What do you expect from him in his first game back? And also coming off, it was a pretty significant hand injury.
Yeah, so we saw, I believe it was in just 2 games. It was like 4 targets in each game, and he might have even left the second game he played. And he was getting a decent amount of air yards in that role. I think he plays some sort of combination of basically what we've seen John Hightower and Travis Fulgham do, who they have these guys split out wide, and they use them to move the chains. They're not like Greg Ward players who have such a low ADOT that you need to rack up targets. They use their outside players to go deep downfield, and we saw that he had, I want to say it was a 27 ADOT. I have it in my Showdown article, which you can find at Awesemo.com. I believe it was a 27 ADOT. Like, he is a tried and true field stretcher, at least in the small sample we have. I think you could even be a high volume field stretcher, which like John Hightower led the team in air yards when they were without all of these guys for like a stretch of 3 weeks. In the first 2 weeks, I believe it was Deshaun Jackson who led the team and was like number 2 in the NFL in air yards. when they basically run like a very tight core of guys getting on the field for a large portion of the snaps. Maybe that changes. That's absolutely subject to change because he is coming back from a serious injury. But the upside is that he basically plays this like high upside Deshaun Jackson style role, which we saw like in very brief flashes, like mostly that game one of last year. Like that role with like Carson Wentz, who as spotty as he has been, has actually played fairly well this year. He's got a strong arm, and like we saw Deshaun Jackson just jammed it in week one last year. There's a lot of potential in the role, and I do think his price doesn't maybe reflect that upside, and I don't think he's going to be incredibly popular either, because all we've seen from him is like 2 games where he got work, but he didn't absolutely pop off. So I actually think there's probably some leverage in just getting him into the flex specifically.
So we have a question here related to Dallas Goedert. Somebody asked, is Goedert going to be limited, or is he going to play full workload? I assume a full workload. He's out there. He's on the field. The other thing, too, is, I mean, look at the importance of this game, right? I mean, the Eagles and Cowboys are playing for the division pretty much at this point. If the Eagles win this game, they take a pretty good stranglehold on the NFC East. I mean, 6 wins for the Eagles, that could very well end up winning the division, and they're halfway there with a win today. It is not going to take much to win the NFC East. This is a very important game. So even if Dallas Goedert, let's say he's 90%, 85%, if he's not back to even full health, I still think he's going to play close to a full workload. So I'm not too concerned about that as it pertains to Dallas Goedert. Corey Clement, I saw some people asking about him in the chat. It's interesting. I mean, the price is so cheap that I can't totally ignore him, and there's only a handful of guys that I think are worth rostering in this price point. I will say I prefer Tony Pollard to Corey Clement, but here's where I think Clement is viable because outside of Tony Pollard, there's nobody I think is a decent play in the sub 2K range. The other thing also is, even though it didn't bear out last week where Clement didn't play all that many snaps, we've seen with the Eagles offense and Doug Peterson in the past that he generally does split up the touches and playing time in the backfield. So I'm not sure that last week's game is totally encompassing of what we're going to see going forward. It's possible. I just don't look at the limited snaps that Corey Clement played and say, for sure, that's what's going to happen this week and every week going forward. So I think that Clement is okay, but given the choice between Clement and Pollard, I personally go Pollard. How do you feel between those two and Clement overall?
Yeah, I feel like it's a pretty strong lean to Tony Pollard for me. It's simply because like these guys are both in the like exact same price range, and one of them, Tony Pollard, has actually got like a lot of work in the past few weeks for a backup running back. Not like a lot of work in the aggregate, but a lot of work for a backup running back. Where we saw as recently as last week, Corey Clement actually gave up work to Jason Huntley. So I think we could see an expanded role from the backup running backs in Philadelphia because, like you said, that is something that we've seen basically the entire time that Doug Peterson has been there. But I do think from what we saw last week, Corey Clement may not even have that backup role completely sealed, whereas Tony Pollard does and could even play like a backup plus, if you want to call that like the role that he could play. So I think Tony Pollard is clearly the guy for me. Corey Clement is mostly just a player you look to get different with, like versus the field in larger field tournaments. I don't think in any small tournaments I'm really getting much Corey Clement.
So whenever there's an NFC East game, I think we would be remiss if we did not mention the kickers, because I think that if there's any spot where the kickers are viable, it's probably a game between the Cowboys and Eagles, or a game where the Giants are involved. Most Thursday night football games actually are usually when the kickers get involved. And this kind of feels like a Thursday night football-esque Sunday night game. So we'll talk about the kickers here. And between the two, I prefer Zuerlein. So here's the deal with the Cowboys offense is, even if they do move the ball downfield, I still have this feeling that with Dinucci at quarterback, they could struggle to score in the red zone. So I think that looking at them at that point of the field, I think that they're probably more likely to be attempting field goals than the Eagles are. That's just my feel on the situation. So I think that if you're looking to roster one of the kickers for value, I lean more towards Zuerlein than I do towards Elliott. The other thing also is overall, I'm just more apt to roster the Eagles players, and lineup construction just makes more sense if you have 4 or 5 Eagles players or something like that. It's hard to think all of them are going to score touchdowns and also the kicker is going to go off. So there's a little bit of negative correlation there by going heavy Eagles and going with Elliott at kicker. So that's why I think that that Zuerlein makes a little bit more sense. But that was a lot of words to talk about kickers. So how do you feel about them?
Yeah, kickers come more into play in games like this, like games like this, this homage to a great Thursday night game, which does have that very much that feel. So when games are lower totals specifically, they do come more into play. They're more prevalent as in the winning lineups of games with lower totals. this game obviously doesn't have a very high total. So my preference here is Jake Elliott simply because we have him as the higher projected play. We actually have him as the best value, basically over $2,000, even like on top of guys like Michael Gallup or Boston Scott, who we like a lot. So I would lean him, but I would very much agree that there is just a certain amount of negative correlation where there are only so many points to go around in Philadelphia. And if you are saying that Philadelphia, like you're jamming in 4 or 5 of their guys, that means you probably expect touchdowns. Like you said, I'm just reiterating what you said, but I think it's important to note that the negative correlation that presents is probably pretty strong, that you just can't have all these guys go off, but then somehow the kicker kick multiple field goals unless it's just an absolute like onslaught of Philadelphia points. So I do agree that I would actually run back Zuerlein in like Philadelphia lineups. And if I'm playing a more balanced lineup, that's where I'd probably get to Jake Elliott, who we have projected as a good play, but not a ton of ceiling or anything in these guys. So I would say it's probably just mostly dependent on what kind of roster construction you're going for.
So I think the only core player left on the Eagles we haven't talked about yet, and I saw some people bring him up, wanted us to talk about him, is Greg Ward. So here's what I think about Greg Ward. I think he's a little bit overpriced and going a little bit over-owned when we consider that Rager's back now. Greg Ward, I think he's okay at 5,000, but I wouldn't say you have to play him or anything like that. And I do think that I would be more apt to even leave salary on the table to get down to Rager, just because I think he's a little bit higher of an upside play. Like I said, there's still a high pedigree on Rager coming out of college. I think there's more upside there. Greg Ward is fine, but we kind of know what he is at this point in his career, where I think the unknown surrounding Rager makes him a little bit more appealing. And I know this is kind of a situation where it's like, well, the mystery box could be anything. And at least with Rager, he's cheap. And I feel like the mystery box is half the players in this contest anyway. So Rager being a first round pick that we don't know all that much about yet, I'm more apt to roster him than Greg Ward. How do you compare the two?
Yeah, so I kind of agree. He's a guy who doesn't have like a ton of upside on an individual play basis, but he could rack up a lot of targets. My only concern is now that they get like Travis Fulgham has broken out. They have like Dallas Goedert back in the fold. They have Boston Scott who can catch passes. Like, do we really see that much work for him that he has the potential for an upside game? Probably not. And if this game is low scoring, you might not need an upside game. You might be able to fill your lineup with like 2 to 3 guys who just scored 10 points. I think that was the Rams showdown slate where like just wasn't a lot of scoring in that game. So if you got guys who got, 8, 9, 10 points, that was good enough. And Greg Ward could be that. But right now we have Dallas Goedert, Jalen Reagor, and Michael Gallup all projected to be lower owned specifically in the utility slots 2 through 6. I would take all those guys over him. So like you said, his price isn't anything to write home about, and his ownership is actually notable versus some other guys. So especially the other Philadelphia receivers or pass catchers returning to the lineup. So because of his ownership, not really a guy I'm probably gonna have much exposure to. Like, he's not a bad play by any means. It's just his price doesn't make me need to get to him, and his ownership says like people are actually going to get to him. So I'll take the leverage play, I guess, with a guy like Jalen Reagor.
All right. Any other plays here from the Eagles we haven't talked about? We didn't really talk about Richard Rodgers. I don't know. I feel like with Goddard back, that's just too much of a price tag to pay for Rodgers. 5,600 on DraftKings, and he is where was he on FanDuel? I can't find him on FanDuel, which makes it also hard. But anyway, more importantly, now that Goddard's back, I just feel like this is a situation where there's where it's just hard to envision that he's going to have that same role that he had before, and the price hasn't moved yet. So if the price had went down, then I think that we could make a case for him, but not really right now with Goddard coming back. Do you think that he's still worth playing even with Goddard in action?
Yeah, I'm not like too big on him right now. So I think the thing is people see that they play so much 2 tight end in Philly, but that's probably because they don't have much of a choice, and they have, or at least like we thought they had. I don't think Zach Ertz is any good anymore, but like they perceive to have like 2 really talented tight ends. They don't have that, and they have actually maybe not like this wealth of options as pass catchers, but it's better than it was in recent weeks. Like now they can actually like run out a viable 3 receiver set. They have like multiple active receivers. They were so hard pressed to find guys who could catch passes. That's probably why we saw a lot of 2 tight end sets. So now that they have like Dallas Goedert back, I think Richard Rodgers is not like completely Xing out of like if I'm building 150, but certainly is a guy who you just do to get like wildly different, because I don't think his projection is really any good at all.
All right, so that brings us right to lock. Good luck tonight, guys. And One thing also we need to mention here, we're closing in on 40,000 subscribers on the YouTube channel. We're only about 80 away, according to Jordan behind the sticks. That's what he has sent me a notification of. So guys, if you're not yet subscribed, get on it, because you could get all of our content, right away as soon as it goes live. Hit that notification bell. And maybe you could be lucky enough to be the 40,000th subscriber. And then also don't forget what I read at the top of the show is that if you like the pin tweet on Awesemo_com and subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast network, one person will randomly selected to win a free month of Awesemo Plus. And you don't have to do anything else. All you have to do is just like the tweet, subscribe. It's as easy as that. Chance for some free cash. So guys, good luck tonight. From me and Kyle, have a good one.